I'm really delighted to be here, and thanks for the invitation, and also to Mark for introducing the topic today so I can move on from there about a study that I conducted in 2022 on British victims. So, who are the victims? Modern slavery and human trafficking are often portrayed as a problem of migration. And, there are obviously many. In fact, in the national referral mechanism that Father Mark referred to earlier on, there were 388 different nationalities referred in the past year. But because it's portrayed as a problem of migration, what tends to happen is that British victims are often ignored. So it's important then to keep this in mind when thinking about how to identify victims. And what I do want to emphasize, though, is that this is not about kind of creating a hierarchy of needs of domestic victims over foreign nationals. It's not about that at all. It's just about recognizing that domestic victims, British victims, have access to support, but that is not being offered because they're not being identified and protected. As Father Mark said, it's important to be curious and understand what the indicators of vulnerability are in the lives of young people with the goal of preventing future exploitation. So just to put this into some kind of context, on the screen there, you will just see in the top line the kind of increase in British victims from 819 in 2017 to 2023, where we had 4,299. And these are just potential victims. These are just the ones that have been identified and they've been referred into the national referral mechanism. In fact, in that period from 2016, aside from 1 year, which was last year, British victims were the highest number of referrals into the national referral mechanism. And that's quite a worrying trend. And that's why it's important to think about British victims. So in the study that I conducted in 2022, we did interviews and we did a survey across the country. We interviewed practitioners, frontline workers, police, local authorities, British Transport Police. We also interviewed survivors. It was a very small study. We interviewed survivors. 6 of them were in the national referral mechanism, 4 female, 3 male. They had experienced both historic exploitation and recent exploitation. So some going back as far as the early 90s, before the national referral mechanism was even existed, or before terms like modern slavery and human trafficking were in the kind of common vocabulary of people. They were trafficked for criminal, labour and sexual exploitation, and some of them were trafficked for more than one type of exploitation. So, I've got very short few minutes to go through this. So I'm just going to kind of very briefly introduce the 3 main themes from the research. So missed opportunities. There were missed opportunities to identify people, to prevent exploitation. So we talked about this in the framework of insecure environments. So what types of insecure environments are British people living in that create vulnerabilities for exploitation? Then we identified that there were missed opportunities to identify and protect. And then we identified specific challenges within the support system for British victims because the system was set up originally to support migrants. So I'm going to give you some examples from the research to bring it alive a bit in terms of some quotes from people that I interviewed. But just in the context of this, prior to exploitation, some survivors had either or both social services and criminal justice professionals visit their family homes. They had been in care settings, alternative educational settings, such as pupil referral units, and they had backgrounds of deprivation, experiencing poverty, and having adverse childhood experiences. And some of them had diagnosed or undiagnosed mental health issues prior to exploitation. And I think one of the really concerning things for me, and I've written about this in another context, is that the missing from school piece. So one of the police, and he wasn't the only one, many people identified this as a problem. Kids that are regularly missing persons, they're regularly missing from home. I suppose if you've got a kid that's regularly going missing, dropping out of school, there are all kinds of indicators for us that make us be mindful of modern slavery. In terms of protection then, some of the issues here were that during exploitation of these people, so during the period they were being exploited, they were in contact with social services, mental health professionals, criminal justice, and health professionals. Victims were also criminalised, directly linked to exploitation. They were not being identified during, for example, labour exploitation. And sometimes professionals are unclear about any advantages for British nationals in being referred to the NRM. And for one example from the research was one of the guys who had been exploited in labour exploitation. And he said that police visited his exploitation site 2 or 3 times over the 7-year period that he had been exploited. So living on this site, and never questioned his living arrangements in a caravan or access to food, water, or sanitary facilities. And he said that if they had taken action, he could have been freed from his situation many, many years earlier. And, you know, obviously this would have had an impact in terms of his experience of long-term abuse. Another survivor that I spoke to talked about going to his social worker and telling her that he was being exploited in criminal exploitation. So he was being forced to sell drugs, to carry guns, etc., etc. And his social worker said, you know, you're a fantasist. Don't come here and tell me stories about you living that kind of lifestyle, because I know it's not true. And this guy, you know, eventually ended up in prison for a couple of years, and it was only in prison where he met somebody who was able to identify that actually he was a victim of modern slavery and human trafficking. And he is now studying criminology in St. Mary's University. So, you know, this is a really good outcome from this research, but nevertheless, it doesn't take away the fact that he was exploited for many, many years with no support from services. Other survivors that I interviewed, and the one on the left was a young woman in recent sexual exploitation. The one on the right had been exploited sexually in the early 90s, and they both talked about their kind of mental health and physical health problems. And so they were in touch with various professionals during this period, but they weren't identified. And, you know, one of them, the one on the left, Kate, said that she was self-harming, she had depression, she didn't talk to anybody about her exploitation, but nevertheless, there is an issue here about when people are coming into contact with some young people who have multiple issues such as this, maybe there is a place where they, if they had more awareness of modern slavery and how people present, they could offer some kind of support. The one on the right, Kelly, had 2 pregnancies and 2 abortions before the age of 18. Nobody picked up on that. There was no investigation as to how she was getting pregnant so often. And there were no questions asked really about her. And she suffered quite a lot, obviously physically, but emotionally as well over a longer period. In terms of the support, a lot of the professionals, because again, it has been constructed, and we've tried to change this with this research, but it has been constructed as a migration issue. They don't really know what to do with British victims. This woman, this professional is saying, I've not really placed much emphasis on this group because the actual numbers of referrals of British survivors are so small, but as we can see, those numbers have been rising quite substantially over recent years. And she identified that a lot of British victims don't get referred out of shame or stigma, so the numbers are not a true reflection of the scale. But on the other hand, in my experience, some of the problems with being referred into the NRM is that they're then referred to local authorities because they're British, and local authorities don't really know what to do with them because they don't have the awareness or the training. So it's not just the public that need to be trained and aware in this issue, it is also professionals that have an obligation to support people. Another professional also identified the kind of multiple complex needs of British victims. So some of them can have substance misuse, children in care, can have problems with accommodation, etc., etc. So they have different issues. They present differently than people who are seeking asylum in the UK after they get support from the NRM. So this again is just about what we don't know enough, or the systems are not set up enough to support British victims. So just to say, what can we do? And I suppose I am focusing quite a lot here on young British victims, but I know, British victims can be of all ages. Some of the guys I interviewed were exploited in construction, for example, well into their 30s and 40s. But a lot of the people I interviewed were young people. And I think what we need to do is, going back to what Father Mark said, was about thinking about what's going on next door, what's going on in my local community. So I think we need to be aware that young people can be coerced and controlled to commit criminal acts. Try not to make assumptions based on young people's behaviour. So sometimes, although some of the indicators might be anxiety, fear, etc., sometimes some of these people are being coerced and controlled by very violent gangs, and so their behaviour may be that they've developed to acting out to cover up their fear. Again, reflecting what Father Mark said, pay attention to people in general who look out of place or appear vulnerable, and have some phone numbers you can call if you suspect someone may be at risk. So either the Modern Slavery Helpline or your local police station. And I think I am going to conclude there, and thank you for listening.